Laryngeals. Why should I care about them if all I want to do is learn Sanskrit? In a nutshell, laryngeals are the reason for various irregular, unsystematic, or apparently random forms in Sanskrit. And if you've ever taken a course with me, you know that I like to try and understand things by turning to underlying systems or basic structures, simply because I find it much easier to understand those systems than to rote memorize or otherwise sufficiently familiarize myself with lots of apparently irregular forms. And so many things in language make sense and can be understood if you just bother learning about their background, and the effects of laryngeals, I think, are very much in that category. Now, for a little bit of background, the laryngeal theory, in its most generally accepted form, says that Proto-Indo-European, the language that Sanskrit and various other languages developed from, had three sounds that later disappeared, but when they disappeared, they left traces. Linguists ended up calling these sounds laryngeals, and the exact nature of the traces left by the laryngeals depended on their environment, that is, the sounds around them, so the sound before the supposed laryngeal and the sound behind it. Now, just to make sure you don't think this is someone pulling a rabbit out of a hat, explaining one set of oddities with another supposed reconstructed set of oddities, this theory is actually based on data from a variety of Indo-European languages. And basically it was noticed that apparent irregularities turned up in the same places in several languages, i.e. in related verb forms or in related noun forms, or in nominal composition before related suffixes, or also in verbal composition before related suffixes. And the laryngeal theory basically follows Occam's razor, all other things being equal. The simplest explanation tends to be the right one. And it says that all these oddities in the same places in different languages can be explained by one root phenomenon, namely laryngeals that once stood in the places where we now see said oddities. The laryngeal theory was first developed in the 19th century, and it was corroborated when Hittite, the Indo-European language with the oldest attested texts, was deciphered in the early 20th century, and sounds were found attested in exactly those places where the laryngeal theory postulates the one-time existence of those laryngeals. So let's look at the main laryngeal traces in Sanskrit. In different languages, the laryngeals left different traces, but as this channel is all about Sanskrit, that's what we're going to focus on. Now, if a laryngeal originally stood between consonants, between two consonants, and then it disappeared, it left as its trace a short I, the vowel short I. If a laryngeal disappeared from behind a vowel, the trace that it left is that it would lengthen that vowel. The vowel R, vocalic R, is an exception here. The trace that a laryngeal leaves when it disappears from behind that is as ear or ur. And if a laryngeal originally stood before a vowel and then disappeared, it left no trace in Sanskrit. So, let's look at some specific Sanskrit examples of this to make this all a little bit less theoretical and abstract. We'll start with I between consonants, because that is something that we find very, very frequently all throughout Sanskrit. For example, whenever a verbal root ends in a consonant, and we add a suffix that begins with a consonant, an I may appear between the two, or it may not. This is what I meant when I earlier said laryngeals explain apparently random phenomena. So, for example, If you take a look at the upper row, the upper table in this, you'll see forms of the verb yuj, to link, to join. And let me see whether I can activate the laser pointer. Here we go. And so we have the ta participle, which involves the use of the suffix ta, the absolutive, which involves toi, the infinitive, which involves tum, the gerundive, which involves tavya. Now, in front of these suffixes, the root appears not as yuj, but as yuk. That's a completely standard internal sandhi. And so I have the ta participle yukta, having been linked. Absolutive yuktwa, having linked. Infinitive yuktum, to link. Gerundive yuktavya, having to be linked, and so on. But then let's look at the bottom table, where you have the exact same forms of the verb pat, to fall, to fly. But here, we don't find these suffixes just added straight to the verbal root. No, we have an I appearing between the root and the suffix. So we have patita, patitwa, patitum, patitavya, and so on. So a different form, apparently, but with the same meanings. So yoktum, to link, patitum, to fall. Yokshyati, he, she, or it will link. Patishyati, he, she, or it will fall or will fly. Now, the laryngeal theory explains this as follows. It says that actually the root pat originally ended in a laryngeal. Now, when you see these forms down here, which have an asterisk in front of them, that indicates that they are reconstructed. We don't ever have them attested as such in any text, but we assume that they existed at some earlier point in the language. And here we have the root pat, which originally ended in a laryngeal, which I'm here representing by means of an uppercase X. And this laryngeal, when it stood between two consonants, for example, because we added a suffix that begins with a consonant to this root, then it appeared, it left the trace of short I. And that's how we have patita, patitwa, patitum, and so on. But remember that the laryngeal theory also says that laryngeals leave no trace if they disappear from before a vowel. At least that's what they do in Sanskrit. No trace if they disappear from before a vowel. And so given that pat is a class 1 verb, a thematic verb, which takes the thematic vowel a and adds that to the verbal root in order to form the present tense stem, we then have our reconstructed root, pat, plus the laryngeal. And the laryngeal stands before the thematic vowel, which is a in the first persons and a in the second and third persons. So pat laryngeal ami, pat laryngeal asi, and so on, simply becomes patami, patasi, patati, and so on. Now, this short I that appeared between consonants was, of course, noticed already by the ancient Indian grammarians more than 2,500 years ago. And they weren't so interested in explaining phenomena, they were just interested in describing them. And so their description of this is that they called some roots where this I did not appear, they called them un-it, which means without I. And it is the technical term for the sound I. And the roots where it did appear, they called sa-it, with I, and sa-it becomes sandhied into set. Now, from a comparative point of view nowadays, we know that this I is the trace that the interconsonantal laryngeal had left when it disappeared. Let's look at some other examples. If I go, for example, to man, to think. Let's start here with the infinitive, man tum, to think. Man tavya, having to be thought. Man syati, which through sandhi becomes man syati, he, she, it will think, and so on. Compare that to jan, to be born, to come to be, where we have jan itum, jan itavya, jan I syati, which through internal sandhi becomes jan I syati, and so on. And so we assume, okay, probably jan originally ended in a laryngeal. Now let's look at the left-hand side of these tables. In the case of the ta participle and the absolutive of man, to think, we have matta and matwa. In the case of jan, the absolutive happens to not actually be attested, but the ta participle is jata. Now what happened here? Why do we get jata? A laryngeal that stands behind a vowel, so the laryngeal theory says, lengthens that vowel. If I have a verb such as han, to kill, or man, to think, or gam, to go, then the ta participles of these roots that all end in nasals look as follows. In order to form a regular ta participle, you have to take the verbal root in 0 grade. 0 grade means 0a, so instead of han, we have hun. Instead of man, we have mun. Instead of gum, we have gum. But these ta participles don't appear as hunta, munta, gumta, but rather, and this is a change that we find very regularly happening throughout Sanskrit, a nasal that stands between two consonants doesn't remain as a nasal, but rather it changes into an a. And so we have hatta, matta, gata. But remember, jan gave us jata, so what's happening here? Well, apparently the laryngeal, which I'm here again representing as a capital X, had consonantal properties. It acted like a consonant. It was a consonant. And so the jun, 0 grade of jan, has a nasal that stood between two consonants, j and the laryngeal. And so this nasal changed into an a. And then when the laryngeal disappeared, it disappeared from behind a vowel, and so the trace that it left was that it lengthened that vowel. Then there are other instances where we find laryngeals disappearing from behind a vowel and lengthening that vowel. For example, take verbal roots that display vritti like a, where the rules require guna a. What do I mean by that? So, roots are a brilliant concept used by the ancient Indian grammarians. A root, or dhatu as they called it, isn't something that is actually found in a text, but it's what's left over when we remove all affixes and all endings from all the different forms that a verb has. And the root that we're left with is the smallest common denominator, if you will. And because it's meant to be this smallest, this minimal form, it's usually cited in its shortest, in its minimal version, i.e. in the 0 grade. So here, yuj to link, bhr to carry, ni to lead. These are all 0 grade roots. They all have 0 grade vowels, u, or e. Sometimes, however, we have roots cited in guna. Gam or watch, gum to go, watch to speak. We can tell that these are not in 0 grade, because 0 grade means 0a. And here we do have a. We have our guna vowel a. We have gum and we have watch. And we find this whenever the 0 grade of a root, for a variety of reasons, does not allow us to infer what the guna and the vritti of that root would be. And so, rather than citing these roots in their minimal, in the 0 grade, they are cited in the guna, in the full grade. But then we've also got a number of roots that are cited with a long a, so with a vritti vowel, sta, dha, ma. What's going on here? This a is actually a guna a that's been lengthened by the laryngeal that once followed it. So, sta, dha, ma, sta to stand, dha to put, ma to measure, originally we assume were sta plus a laryngeal, dha plus a laryngeal, ma plus a laryngeal. And this laryngeal, when it disappeared, from behind that vowel, from behind that guna a. What did it do? It lengthened that a to an a, which basically looks like a vritti vowel. Sta, dha, ma. If, on the other hand, we use these roots in the 0 grade, then what do we find? We have the 0 grade of the root, which means 0 a. So instead of sta plus the laryngeal, we have st plus the laryngeal. Now, if I take the ta participle of that, that is, I add ta to this root, I have my laryngeal standing between two consonants. And what does a laryngeal do when it disappears from between two consonants? It leaves a trace, namely short i. And so the ta participle of sta is stita. The ta participle of ma is mita. Now, in the case of the ta participle of dha, to put, we actually have a further change. It's not dhita, but instead it's hita. This is also a regular development from a voiced aspirated sound that is weakened just to an aspiration, to the h. But at any rate, we've got the same vowel interchange from an a in the guna to an I in the 0 grade, or reconstructed from a plus laryngeal in the guna and just the laryngeal, the interconsonantal laryngeal, in the 0 grade. Now, we just looked at verbs where we had combined traces of laryngeals, namely an I if the laryngeal disappeared between consonants, and an a if it disappeared from a guna form, so behind an a. But we find similar combined traces, for example, in class 9 verbs. Now, class 9 verbs are athematic verbs, and athematic verbs have 2 stems. In the active singular, they have a strong stem with a specific element in guna, and everywhere else they have a so-called weak stem, which has that same specific element in the 0 grade, i.e. without a, because 0 grade means 0 a. For example, class 5, up, to reach, to get. Class 5 verbs add the suffix no to the root in the strong stem and nu to the root in the weak stem. No, let me reactivate my laser pointer, here we go. No is the suffix that we find in the active singular, in the strong stem, and nu is what we find basically everywhere else. In the third plural, we find it with a little bit of internal sandhi. O is a guna vowel. It's what you get when you add an a in front of an u. So au becomes o, no. And nu is a 0 grade vowel, and so we have a completely regular phenomenon. We have this variable element in the guna, in the strong stem, and in the 0 grade in the weak stem. Then class 2 verbs, also irregular verbs, also athematic verbs, I mean. So here what varies is not some suffix, it is the root itself. The root I, to go, appears as e. E is the guna of I in the singular, where we expect the strong stem, and it appears as I, which is just the regular 0 grade in the weak stem. And again, in the third person plural, we get it with a little bit of internal sandhi. I in front of an a becomes y. So we have e in the strong stems, that's the guna of I, and we have I in the weak stems, and I is just the 0 grade of I. Another example, class 7 verbs, such as yuj, to link, form their present tense stem not by adding a suffix behind the root, so to the right of this j, but instead they add an infix into the root before the consonant that stands at the end of that root, so before this j. And the infix that they add is na in the strong forms and just n, just an n in the weak forms. So 0 grade means 0 a. The guna, the strong form that we find is na. The weak form, the 0 grade, has 0 a, so it's just an n. And this N then changes through internal sandhi depending on the consonant that follows, where we have the J appearing as a J, so as a palatal, the N appears as a palatal N, where we have the J appearing as a K, so as a velar, the N appears as a velar N. So that's just regular internal sandhi, but what interests us here is that usual contrast between na, the Guna suffix, I keep saying suffix, apologies, the Guna infix, and n, the zero grade infix. So that was 3 examples of how athematic verbs are meant to work. The strong stem has an element appearing in Guna, and the weak stem has that same element appearing in zero grade. So now, let's finally come to class 9 verbs, such as ash, to eat. What happens here? To form the strong stem, in the singular, we have the suffix na, which doesn't really look like Guna, but okay. And then, to form the weak stem, we have the suffix ni. And now ni doesn't look like the zero grade of na. And furthermore, in the third person plural, we have ni, 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 but then in the third person plural, we have just n. So, what is going on here? Class 9 verbs actually are class 7 verbs, but they're class 7 verbs whose final consonant, and yes, apparently, it was a consonant, is a laryngeal. Let's just very quickly remind ourselves, yuj had this strong stem yu na j, and the weak stem yu n j, which then sandhi to yunj with a palatal N. Class 9, on the other hand, ash, to eat, we can reconstruct. You can here see the asterisk that indicates this is a reconstructed form. We can reconstruct as having ended in a laryngeal, here once again represented as capital X. And so the strong stem would have added na before this laryngeal, and the weak stem would have added n before that laryngeal. What does that give us? In the third singular, we have the laryngeal standing behind this infix na, behind this a, so behind a vowel, and whenever a laryngeal disappears from behind a vowel, what's the trace that it leaves? It lengthens that vowel, and that's how we get ashnati, so how we get na instead of na. Na simply is na plus laryngeal, and then when the laryngeal disappeared, it lengthened the na to na. We'll skip the third dual for just 1 second. In the third plural, we have the weak stem, so we don't have ash plus na, but instead we have ash plus n, plus the laryngeal at the end of the verbal root. So what happens? The laryngeal disappears from the position of standing before a vowel. The ending in the third plural, even in athematic verbs, is anti, so it begins with a vowel. The laryngeal disappears from in front of a vowel, which means it leaves no trace, and this is how we arrive at ash plus n, which is our weak infix, and then the laryngeal disappears and we have just anti, and that's how we get ashnanti. Now let's look up one line up to the third dual. There, we're actually not quite sure exactly what happened. What we can see is that the laryngeal left as a trace a long E. And there actually is a lot of discussion whether this would have been a regular development of some kind, or whether we wouldn't have actually expected this laryngeal to have turned into an I, because as you can see, the laryngeal, again represented by a capital X, would have stood between 2 consonants, the N and of the infix, and the T of the tach of the ending, and a laryngeal in between 2 consonants. When it disappears, leaves as a trace a short I, so we might have expected ashnitach, presumably. And we're not quite sure how this long E originated. One theory says that perhaps it's an analogy with this na in the in the strong stem, that they then had na strong, ni weak. We're not quite sure. Notice also that when we have the citation forms of class 9 verbs, such as pu, to clean, to purify, we cite these as pu, because what we've got there is a verbal root, pu, plus laryngeal, and this pu plus laryngeal turns into pu, because when the laryngeal disappears from behind a vowel, it leaves as its trace the lengthening of that vowel. So pu plus laryngeal becomes pu. But compare the actual inflected forms, punati, punitach, punanti. What's happening there? Well, if you take a look, let me reactivate my trusty laser pointer. If you take a look, the laryngeal that originally lengthened the u to become pu, now it doesn't stand behind that u anymore, it stands behind this a. And so it leaves as its trace, when it disappears, a lengthening of this a, not of this u. And so we have the root pu, but the third singular present tense pu nati with a short u. And again, in the other forms, in the third dual and the third plural, the laryngeal doesn't stand right behind this u anymore of the root, but we've got this n in between. And so the laryngeal doesn't interact with the u, it interacts with either the two consonants that it stands between or with the vowel in front of which it stands. Then, an example of the trace that laryngeals leave if they disappear from behind a vocalic R. Take a verb such as per, class 9, per nati, again, per long R, but per nati with a short R, to fill, which has as its, it doesn't have a ta participle regularly, but it has a na participle, which is basically the same thing, except that it uses a it uses a na instead of a ta, has purna. This is p plus r plus laryngeal plus na. So the laryngeal disappearing behind a vocalic R leaves us this trace of ur. Now if you look at other verbs such as stir, der, ter, and there's a number of others, you will find that their ta participles are also na participles, and they become stirna from stir. From der we get dirna, from ter we get tirna. And it seems that in all of these cases we have the trace of a laryngeal following a vocalic R. But if what precedes is a P, a sound where you touch the lips, or you have the lips touch one another, you find the vowel that results when the laryngeal disappears not being an E, but a vowel with lip rounding, an U, so purna. Whereas after a dental, for example, you don't have any interaction of the lips happening, and the vowel that results is an E, so we have stirna, dirna, and tirna. Note, by the way, that these roots, br, stir, der, ter, are also listed with short vowels, br, str, dr, tr, because we don't actually find a form where this long vocalic R is visible. So if you look at the present tense forms, you have per nati, you have stir nati, der nati. Ter is a class 1 verb mainly, so we have tarati. And so you don't have a form where this ter, der, stir, per is attested as such. And that's why you find these cited differently in different reference works. Now, those were a number of things where we find the systematic traces of laryngeals in systematic parts of the verbal system, so in class 9 verbs, in ta participles, in other present tense forms. But there's also many little non-systematic forms where the traces of laryngeals can be witnessed. And I just want to give you one example, the word sunara, which you get in Vedic literature, and it means of good strength or of good life force, and therefore glad. Now, this sunara is actually a bahuvrihi, consisting of su, meaning good, which I'm sure you've seen in lots and lots of compounds, and the word nara, which in classical Sanskrit you mostly encounter with the meaning of man, but especially earlier you also find it with the meaning of manly force, manly strength. So if this Bahuvri is a combination of su plus nara, then why do we find su nara and not su nara? Well, you may have guessed it. The answer is once again a laryngeal. But how? Well, we know from other languages that this word for man or manly strength actually used to begin with a laryngeal. And for example, in Greek, a laryngeal that stands at the beginning of a word, so word initially, before a consonant, leaves a trace, and it leaves as its trace a vowel. In Sanskrit, a laryngeal standing at the beginning of a word before another consonant leaves no trace. And that's why we get pairs such as Sanskrit nar or nara, and Greek ner, which means man, or Sanskrit na man, but Greek noma, which means name. And so this ner and noma, these are the traces that original word initial laryngeals left in Greek, but in Sanskrit they don't leave a trace, and that's why we get naman and nara. But when we find this compound of nara, which is an old compound, we find it attested in the oldest texts in Vedic. Apparently, what we get here is a reflex of a situation when the laryngeal, here once again represented as an uppercase X, was still there at the beginning of nara. And so if you have su plus this word for nara that began with a consonant, the laryngeal stood behind a vowel, namely short u. And what trace does a laryngeal leave when it disappears from behind a vowel? It lengthens that vowel. And that's how we get su nara rather than su nara. But we can actually also find laryngeals explaining other phenomena beyond the ones that we've already mentioned. So, for example, the reason why we have perfect forms such as first singular u-wa-cha, but third singular u-wa-cha with a long vowel, the answer behind that is laryngeals. Why we have causative forms without a long vowel in the initial syllable. So gamayati as opposed to perhaps expected gamayati, in parallel with bharayati and other such verbs. But to understand these laryngeal traces, we need to take a step back and we need to understand something called Brugmann's law. So let's look at Brugmann's law. Now, we know that the Proto-Indo-European vowels a, e, and o, let me reactivate my laser pointer, the vowels a, e, and o, which remain as a, e, o, separate vowels in other languages, we know that they all became a in Sanskrit. And we also know that the Proto-Indo-European vowels a, e, and o all became Sanskrit a. So, for example, and there's lots and lots of examples, I've just picked a couple. So the word nepot, which we get in Latin to mean nephew or grandson, and which we get in English nepotism, appears in Sanskrit as napad. Reg, which is the root behind the Latin word for king, where we, for example, get English regal from, in Sanskrit appears as raj. Penta, which is the Greek word for five, which is where we get, for example, the English pentagon from, corresponds to Sanskrit pancha. So two E's corresponds to two A's. Genu, which is the Latin word for knee, which we get in English genuflect, to bend your knee, appears in Sanskrit as janu. So that just as a couple of examples out of many, many, many hundreds that the vowels that in Indo-European were a, e, o, and a, e, o, and stayed as such in many other languages, in Sanskrit all became a. And that's kind of the reason why in Sanskrit you have so many a's, and you have words like Mahabharata and Ramayana and Maharaja and so on. But short o in an open syllable becomes long a, and that's what Brugmann's law says. So a, e, o normally all become a, but short o in an open syllable becomes a long a. let's remind ourselves, an open syllable means that this is a syllable that ends in a vowel. How does a syllable end in a vowel? Well, it ends in a vowel whenever we have a vowel that is followed by only one consonant. And this one consonant then counts as standing at the beginning of the following syllable. So bharati can be syllabified as bha-ra-ti. And so, for example, this a here stands at the beginning of the middle syllable, and that means this syllable ends in a vowel, it ends in an a, and that's why we call it an open syllable. Ra, also an open syllable, ti, also an open syllable. Likewise with Ramayana. So we have only one consonant between vowels. We only ever have one consonant following each vowel, and so these consonants, the m and the y and the n, count as standing at the beginning of their syllables. Ra, ma, ya, na. But contrast that with, for example, dharma, where you have two consonants following after a vowel, and so we split this up as dharma. And so dhar is a syllable that ends in a consonant, and that would be a closed syllable. Likewise with mantra, we have not one, not two, but three consonants after this a, and so we count the first consonant as standing at the end of the first syllable, man, and we count the other consonants as standing at the beginning of the next syllable, and so we get mantra. And again, man is a syllable that ends in a consonant, and so it counts as closed. So, open syllable ends in a vowel, closed syllable ends in a consonant. Why is that relevant for us? For example, if you have thematic verbs where you have ami, awach, amach in the first persons, so bharami, bharawach, bharamach, but in the second and third persons you don't have a long a, but you've got a short a, so you have bharami, bharasi, bharati, bharawach, and so on. What's actually happening is that this bharami, this long a, goes back to a thematic vowel o, whereas in the second and third person, the thematic vowel was an e. How do we know this? Well, we see it as o versus e in other languages where o and e remain separate. And in Sanskrit, the e just becomes an a, but the o that stands in an open syllable, bhe, ro, mi, this o becomes a long a. Brugmann's law is also the reason why we get the third singular perfect form babhara and uvacha and papata and all of these other verbal forms where you have in the third singular the verbal root standing in apparently vritti. What's happening here? Originally this form would have been be, bho, ra. So in the perfect the root appears with an original o. And when we split this up into syllables, we get be, bho, ra. And so this o stands at the end of an open syllable, and according to Brugmann's law, it becomes a long a. Likewise, with causatives such as bharayati and so on. The reason why we have in the causative the a vritti a rather than a guna a in this case is because, again, this originally would have been a bho. This would have the root would have had o as a vowel. We add our suffix aya, and this originally would have been bho or bhor plus eya, a suffix eya plus our ending t. This would have been syllabified as bho re ye ti. And so again, the bho would have stood at the end of, the o would have stood at the end of an open syllable, and an o at the end of an open syllable develops into an a in Sanskrit. That's Brugmann's law, and so that's why we get bharayati in these forms. Now, we know about these os, so in bebhora, in beromi, in bharayati, for example, because they're there in parallel forms in related languages, such as Latin and Greek, where a, e, o remained separate. Okay, nice. But what's that got to do with laryngeals? The ending of the first singular, active, perfect, would have been laryngeal plus a. Even earlier, it would have been laryngeal e. That gives us a first singular that would have been be, bor plus laryngeal a, and a third singular, be, bor plus actually just the ending a. Now, why is that relevant? If we syllabify these forms, then we have here a consonant cluster. We have two consonants. A laryngeal apparently at one point behaved as a consonant. So we have o plus two consonants, and that means that the r, the first consonant in this cluster, stands at the end of the first syllable, and the laryngeal stands at the beginning of the next one. So we would have had be, bor, laryngeal a, and this would have thus been a closed syllable ending in a consonant, and therefore the o just developed, changed into a short a. Whereas in the third singular, where the ending originally would have been an a, or even earlier it would have been an e, if we syllabify this, we then have be as our first syllable, bha as our second syllable, ra as our third syllable. There's only one consonant, and if you only have one consonant, it counts as standing at the beginning of the syllable. And so bha here is standing in an open syllable. And if you have an o at the end of an open syllable, according to Brugmann's law, it becomes a long a. So we had an ending, laryngeal a, for the first person singular. That means that this form would originally have been syllabified differently. This syllable would have been bor, it would have been a closed syllable, and the o in a closed syllable simply becomes a short a. Whereas down here, the syllabification would have made this an open syllable, and an o at the end of an open syllable becomes an a, according to Brugmann's law, and so that's why we get babhara in the third singular, but babhara in the first singular. That's also the reason for this long a in all of these other forms, like uvacha, which I'm sure all of you have heard, that you find in all these other third singular perfect active forms. Now, what happened to the laryngeal? Well, the position that the laryngeal stood in was before a vowel. When a laryngeal disappears from before a vowel in Sanskrit, it leaves no trace. And so that's why we get ba-bhar plus a, ba-bhar plus a. It looks like the ending is identical, and we just have, weird things happening in the stem. But no, the ending now is identical, but originally it wasn't. Originally we had laryngeal plus a, or even earlier a. And here we had just a, or even earlier a. And that means that here we have an open syllable, which leads to a long a, whereas here we had a closed syllable, which meant that the short o simply developed into a short a. Then, if you look at causatives, a regular causative would also have had its verbal root with an o in it. And again, we know this because we find it like that in many other in other related languages. And so we would have had the root bor plus our suffix eya, which is what we can reconstruct aya as being. And so we would have had bhoreity, which we syllabify as bho re ye ti. Single consonants all stand at the beginning of their syllable. And so bha is an open syllable with an o at its end, and that then develops into a long a according to Brugmann's law, bharayati. But some causatives have a guna root, not a vrti root. And those are causatives that are formed of roots that originally ended in a laryngeal. So jan, to be born, to come to be, which we were looking at earlier, originally would have had a laryngeal, again here represented as a capital X. And so I would have had my root jan with the vowel appearing as an O. And then I would have had my laryngeal, and then I would have had my eya and my ti for the third singular, for example. And so this means that I have the N plus the laryngeal, I have a consonant cluster, which means that the first consonant stands at the end of the first syllable, And this first syllable would have thus been John, the second one laryngeal then ye, and then t. And so this would have been a closed syllable, and the o in a closed syllable just becomes a regular a. There's no there's no factor, there's nothing that would make it turn into a long a. It is not subject to Brugmann's law, because Brugmann's law only affects o at the end of open syllables. Same with other verbs such as chal or char, which means to move, and various others, where we find chalayati or charayati. That again is because char originally ended in a laryngeal, and thus once again we have this verbal root, which would appear as chor plus the laryngeal, giving us a closed syllable. The R stands at the end of the first syllable, the second consonant, the laryngeal, stands at the beginning of the next syllable. And so we don't have cho, re, ye, ti, but we've got chor, laryngeal ye, ti. And so this is a closed syllable, and this o is not subject to Brugmann's law, and thus it's not lengthened, and we get chor, ayati, or cha, rayati, later cha, layati, with a short a. So, we've been looking at all of these irregularities, and in languages you sometimes have irregularities that are surprisingly constant, that go on existing for a good long time. But sometimes irregularities are evened out in various ways. And given that laryngeals had disappeared by the time the earliest Sanskrit text, the Rig Veda, was composed, the traces that the laryngeals left when they disappeared must have appeared random to speakers of the language even back then. And as happens often across languages, many apparently unmotivated irregularities are evened out as time goes by. And so, once the laryngeals had disappeared and it wasn't clear anymore where those apparently random long vowels came from, for example, class 9 verbs were regularized. So we have the verb kri with the present tense form kri-nati rather than kri-nati, where we have this long I regularized, perhaps an analogy with forms such as krita, the ta participle, kritwa, the absolutive, and so on. In ver, class 9, vernati, to choose, we get a short a everywhere. So in ver, in verta, in vertwa, perhaps in analogy with the present tense forms, where the short a is regular and expected, because the laryngeal in those present tense forms doesn't lengthen the a, but rather it lengthens the a in the na. So that's why we get vernati. Then we have instances of perfect forms regularized. So in many verbal paradigms, the first singular of the perfect and the third singular of the perfect are identical. So when you have the verb wish, to enter, you have a first singular and a third singular, perfect indicative active, we wisha. Much, to free, first singular and third singular, perfect indicative active, mu mocha. Then we have those verbs where in the third singular, because of Brugmann's law, we have this lengthened, we have this apparent vrti root, so we have uwacha. And the first singular form, which has this regular form uwacha, regular because the ending originally contained a laryngeal, which prevented Brugmann's law from applying. So originally we had first singular uwacha and third singular uwacha. And then we have in the first singular a possible alternative form developing uwacha, which has the result that first singular and third singular again are identical. And then we have more regularizations in perfect forms in verbs that ended originally in consonant plus laryngeal, which therefore should not have this vrti of the root, which would have been caused by an o and in an open syllable that through Brugmann's law then gave us an a, but that should theoretically just have been an a, because if you have, for example, per, to fill, that would have had pe, por, so the root appears with a vowel o, Then we've got R, sorry, plus the laryngeal. The cluster of R and laryngeal means that this syllable is not open because it ends in a consonant. And therefore the O should have just changed into an A and not into an A, according to Brugmann's law, because Brugmann's law only applies to O at the end of open syllables. But that there once was a laryngeal in here, apparently, knowledge of that did not survive. How should it have? And so we then find the quote-unquote regular form of a verbal root such as this, where we have a third singular, papara, rather than papara. And here also we then find as an alternative form for the first singular, papara, simply because it's in parallel with this third singular, papara. So first singular and third singular are identical, or can be identical. And we get this with other verbs. Der, we have a perfect third singular, dadara. Ter, we have tatara. Pat, we have papata, and so on, even though in all of these this may seem regular, but it's not what we would have originally expected. Then, likewise in causatives, we have various verbs that add the regular form to the original but now apparently irregular form. So, chal or char, to move, adds a form chalayati in addition to chalayati. Kram adds kramayati in addition to kramayati. There we go. Pad, fall to fly, adds patayati in addition to patayati, and so on. Also, rather than displaying this irregular combination of guna a and zero grade I, we talked about that earlier, for example, in the verb sta, which then had the zero grade I in a form such as stita, a number of verbs only ever display this guna a, so a plus laryngeal, which becomes a. For example, class 2 verbs that end in a only have a strong stem, so only have a plus laryngeal becoming a. So yati, to go, has a third singular yati, as we would expect, but also a third plural yanti. Verbs like kad, to eat, only ever have this form kad with that long a. So we have the tap participle kadita, we have the stem chakad in the perfect, throughout the perfect, so no change between strong and weak stem. We just have the strong stem, which has this guna a that's been lengthened to a by a laryngeal. Verbs such as jña, to know, have a tap participle jñata, where we simply have the guna root plus ta in this participle, where regularly we would expect the zero grade of the root, but the zero grade of the root would look weird in combination with this root jña, and so we just find the root jña used for jñata. Then, in the perfect of all Sanskrit verbs, we have an I, a short vowel I appearing, whenever a perfect stem ends in a consonant, and the endings begin with a consonant. So, for example, in the second singular, we wish plus the ending ta, we have we wishita. In the first dual, we have we wish iwa. We have in the first plural, we wish ima. So whenever the perfect stem ends in a consonant and the ending begins with a consonant, we have an I appearing between the two. And presumably, this I would have originated in verbs that once ended in a laryngeal, and the interconsonantal laryngeal between the consonant at the end of the root and the consonant at the beginning of the ending. This interconsonantal laryngeal would have left an I as its regular trace. And apparently, from verbs where the laryngeal would originally have existed, this I was extended to verbs that didn't originally have it. And this regularization across perfect verb forms had the effect that there is no internal consonant sandhi in perfect forms, which just is, quite useful. Sometimes it seems like the language went even further and made active use of these laryngeal traces. So if you had the impression that to form a ta participle can be done by adding ta or by adding ita, or an infinitive can be done by adding tum or adding itum, then you make use of this apparently free variation. And so, inserting an I the laryngeal trace from originally between two consonants. Inserting an E between a verbal root and a suffix beginning with a consonant can, for example, remove the need for internal sandhi and thus keep paradigms more unified. So, for example, lab, to take, labhate, did originally not end in a laryngeal, and so the original future that we find in the Brahmanas, so in Vedic texts, is lapsyate or lapsyati. And so we have regular internal sandhi of the bh, the voiced aspirated labial, losing its voice, losing its aspiration in front of the s of the future marker sya, and therefore becoming lapsyate. In classical Sanskrit, we then get labhishyati with this ishya, the future suffix originally from verbs that ended in laryngeals, apparently avoiding the need to change that bh at the end of the root through internal sandhi. And actually we have many verbs without an original laryngeal having a future in ishya rather than sya. So of gam we have gamishyati, kar we have karishyati, ish to want, present tense ichati, we have a future eshishyati. Just easier, no need for internal sandhi of any kind. And sometimes inserting an E between a verbal root and a suffix that begins with a consonant creates a metrical variant. And perhaps that was helpful in a language that is regularly used in metrical texts. So, for example, of gum, to go, we find a desiderative jigamishati and jigansati. Of tyaj, to abandon, we find a future tyajishyati and a future tyakshyati. Of tur, to cross, we find infinitives tartum and taritum. Of brahm, to wander, we find absolutives brahmitva or brantva, and so on and so on. There are lots of examples. So, to wrap up, a final nutshell. Laryngeals once existed, and then they disappeared, and when they disappeared they left different traces. For example, a short E between consonants. Behind a vowel they lengthened that vowel. Before a vowel they disappeared without a trace. These traces often seemed irregular or random because, people didn't know what the reason behind those traces was. The laryngeals were gone after all. Many of these traces existed throughout the history of Sanskrit. Some of them were regularized away, and sometimes actually laryngeal traces were used to create alternative forms in verbs in verbal roots that never had a laryngeal to begin with. Now, this video was meant to be practical rather than scholarly. I'm sure that I know that I have simplified a number of things, and I haven't gone into all the details that might have been relevant, but that's simply because I would like this video to be useful for people who just want to know or just want to learn Sanskrit. If, however, you belong to those who would like to know more and who have the interest of a scholar of comparative or historical linguistics, rather than just, in quotation marks, an interest in learning Sanskrit, there is a lot of interesting literature on laryngeals, and the Wikipedia entry on the laryngeal theory actually is a very good point for starting your studies, because it has cross-references to pretty much all the standard literature on laryngeals. It has more details on the development of the laryngeal theory, and it also has lots of material on the laryngeals as they appear in languages other than Sanskrit. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Take care.